Our speaker, as I said, was on a flight from DC. He came up just for this event, and his flight was delayed, and now he's stuck in traffic. Just a usual Tuesday evening Boston story. But I trust that he will join us in a couple of minutes. I wanted to get started, and first of all, greet every one of you. Thank you for coming. This is actually the day of the 1956 Hungarian Revolution. It broke out on October 23rd, and it's a national day in Hungary for two reasons. One is the 1956 revolution, and the second, that the proclamation of the Republic, so actually our newly found independence in 1989, was proclaimed on this day on October 23rd as a tribute to the 1956 revolution and the role that 1956 has played in the Hungarian psyche. And also Hungarians felt in 1989 that our dreams of 1956 came true in 1989 by finally gaining our independence. So it was a long, 33 years long revolution. I want to, first of all, thank our co-sponsors, the Center for Strategic Studies, the International Security Studies Program, and the Russia and Eurasia Program for supporting us, and also the Victims of Communism Foundation for bringing our guest up to speak to us. And I want to recognize a few people in the audience. First of all, Professor Richard Shultz, Director of the International Security Studies Program. Thank you for your support. I want to recognize Jenifer Burckett-Picker, who is the Director of the Ph.D. program and the MA program here at Fletcher. Thank you for joining us. And I would like to actually ask both of you to tell us, you mentioned that you have firsthand memories of the 1956 revolution, and what are those memories, and what do you remember it?
Oh, I
if you would.
A child, obviously, in 1956, but I was alive. And I just remember my parents talking about this revolution, and I didn't know too much about it. But then very shortly thereafter, some of my parents' best friends gave refuge to a Hungarian freedom fighter that had leave Hungary very quickly. And he spent a year living with his family in Cambridge. I grew up in Cambridge as a child. So I just remember him. His name was Attila. That was a great name for him. And I just remember, he was learning English. He was trying to find a job. He was trying to survive. But his family friends were letting him stay in their house. I then also just told Zoltan that next week another Hungarian friend of mine will be visiting Boston for the first time. And he found out very recently that the father and mother that he grew up with, the father was not his real birth father. His birth father had been one of the leaders of the Hungarian Revolution and had to flee Hungary in 1956. And this man fled to the United States, lives in Cincinnati, and about 4 years ago became reconnected with his son. So they have now connected, and the man is in his mid-90s, and my friend comes over every year to visit him, so that's interesting.
Professor Shultz, what is your recollection?
I was trying to think about when I really learned about this, and I don't remember it, half of it, but I grew up, in central Pennsylvania, in a steelworkers family, and in that area I grew up in, there were a lot of Hungarians, and I played football with them. We played football together, and I remember I was just thinking about this, as I was sort of scratching my memory, and I remember, in high school, them talking about this and their families.
So they were recent
they were recent, and we were all football players. We were all from working class families, and we all wanted to avoid the steel mill. So we played football to get out of there. Yeah.
Incredible. We also have with us Susan Banki, who lives in the area and is a Fletcher grad. And she mentioned to me that her father was a 1956 Hungarian refugee. We call them 1956ers those Hungarians who were refugees to the United States. The United States took in a large number of Hungarian refugees after fleeing repression after the revolution was crushed by the Soviets.
Hi, most of you don't know me, so I'm a graduate, and it took me 8 years, so despair not. I mean, that was for the Ph.D. And now I'm back just teaching one class for the semester.
What are you teaching, Susan?
Global migration.
Oh,
and of
wow.
course, my interest in migration stems directly from the fact that my father was a refugee himself. But before I even understood what it meant, I knew that my father was a refugee. I knew that he had escaped something called the 1956 revolution. I honestly didn't know what it meant for many years, and as I just admitted to Zoltan, until today, I still don't know enough of the specifics. I do know that he was not one of the leaders, unlike Jenifer's friend, but I know that there was still repression against those that were considered intellectuals in any way. And my father, being a textile engineer, was close enough, and he left. And you know, unfortunately, my father died 10 years ago, but I'll never forget. Every time he told me the story of having to leave, say goodbye to his parents for what he thought was the last time, he burst into tears. This was a grown man with a child. Every time he talked about it, and it made me think about what it means to be a country that has the courage to uprise, and what sometimes the unfortunate consequences are. And just on the topic of sports, you'll love to hear this. Again, way before I understood the Cold War, way before I understood communism, it was an international hockey game that was played, the Americans against, no, it was the Canadians against the Soviets. And my father, hockey, and my father was glued to the television. And even though he was kind of a sports guy, it wasn't enough for that. And I realized at that moment there was something about this game that was of incredible import to him. To watch Canada, the West, beat Russia, the East, in this sport. And to this day, I actually have an audio recording of him watching that game and what it was like for him, the victory when Canada won. Quite a powerful moment for me, before I even understood what it meant.
What incredible stories. Thank you, all three of you, for sharing. I wanted to mention, because you mentioned the hockey game that your father watched so avidly, I mentioned this to Professor Shultz the other day as we were preparing for this event. We were talking about 1956, and there's an incredible movie, documentary, that was made, that came out 12 years ago, in 2006, for the 50th anniversary of the revolution. It's called Freedom's Fury. It was made in the United States, but by two Canadian siblings, actually, the director and the director of photography, Colin Keith Gray and Megan Rainey Aarons. And Freedom's Fury is about both the revolution and also the Melbourne Olympics. Because what happened at the Melbourne Olympics was there was a water polo game. This was the Summer Olympics, but it was held late that year. In 1956, there was a water polo game between the teams of Hungary and of the Soviet Union. And that game has come to be known as the bloodiest match in history, because the boys were just going at it. And back then, I don't know how familiar you guys are with water polo. Hungary, has been always, at the, kind of world, top of water polo. So we happen to know, more about it. It's a great sport, but it back then rules were somewhat liberal, so you could do a lot underwater, and they were hurting each other like badly. It was bloody, but the motivation was the same as for your father, Susan, for watching that game. The Hungarians wanted to beat the Soviet Union so badly, and they did, but it was brutal. So the filmmakers actually brought all of the still living Hungarian players together. After 50 years, most of them immigrated. A lot of them live in the United States, or lived in the United States 12 years ago. And they also brought them together with some of the Russian players, which was wonderful. So I really, really warmly recommend that movie. And so part of the reason I came to know the movie was I was a diplomat, Hungarian diplomat in Washington, D.C. in 2006, and I was in charge of the year-long commemorations for the 50th anniversary of the 1956 revolution. And I heard about the movie, and I heard that one of the executive producers, Lucy Liu, the actress of Charlie's Angels fame and a lot of great movies, she actually went to school with the director, and they got her to to give her name and credibility to the movie. And she was going to appear at the premiere of the movie in Budapest, but she had to cancel for some personal reasons. And then I got the idea, why don't we organize the Washington, D.C. premiere of the movie with Lucy Liu, and we did. And it was in November of 2006, pretty much towards the end of our year-long series of commemorations. And we had Lucy Liu and the Hungarian ambassador and the filmmakers and all the executive producers. We also had Congressman Tom Lantos, who was born in Hungary, and it was held at the Uptown Theater, which is the biggest movie theater in Washington, D.C. It was a wonderful tribute. And again, the movie is about the water polo match and the Olympics as much as it is about the revolution. So I really recommend that. So we are here today on October 23rd, and there's a reason for that. This is the actual day when the revolution broke out in 1956. And before, hopefully our speaker will arrive and enlighten us about a lot of the context around the revolution. Let me give you a little bit of historical background. So Hungary obviously lies in Eastern Europe, and so we were unfortunate enough to end up in the Soviet sphere at the end of the Second World War. The U.S. also took part in the liberation of Hungary, bombing Budapest, the Nazi, German army in Budapest. We were occupied by Nazi Germany, and but the Soviets really were the bulk of the force liberating Hungary from the Nazis, and the Nazis fought to their last breath. And so Hungary was liberated by the Red Army in the spring of 1945, so very much towards the end of the war in Europe. The war in Europe ended on May 9th of 1945, and to this day we celebrate that as Europe Day. And so we ended up in the Soviet sphere of influence, and formally the Allied nations, the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and France, they all took part in the Allied, governance of the occupied countries. But in Hungary, it was clear that the Soviets dominated the transition process, the post-war transition process. So there was a creeping communist takeover in Hungary. First, we did have a post-war transition to a representative democracy. We declared the republic in 1945, and we had free elections in 1945 and then in 1946. And then in 1947 we had elections, but they weren't free because the communists voted twice. They manipulated the electoral process. But by that time, the communists were part of the government, and slowly but surely, the communists who were controlled by the Soviet Union's leadership in Moscow, the Hungarian communists got rid of the other political parties. There were campaigns against the centrist parties and the conservative parties, and also the Social Democratic Party. And so slowly they became the only legitimate political party with the Social Democrats, but the communists forced the Social Democrats to merge with the Communist Party in 1948. And that's what we call the year of the turn. So that's when things turned, and that's when Hungary became a communist dictatorship. And when I say communist dictatorship, I mean Stalinist dictatorship, the worst kind of communist dictatorship. This was still, during the the rule of Stalin in Moscow, obviously, with all that, with all that means for the occupied countries, and his students, his Hungarian students, were just as brutal in governing Hungary as Stalin and his circle back in the Soviet Union. And so we had a building out of a system of total repression and oppression in Hungary, which was in full force by 1949. So the year of the turn was 1948. Communist Stalinist dictatorship in full force. So there were no political parties other than the Communist Party, which was then, because of the merger with the Social Democrats, was called the Hungarian Workers' Party. They occupied all branches of government, obviously, and they made Hungary, they transformed Hungary into a Soviet-type communist state, where the Communist Party was the leading political force. The Communist Party was really governing the country instead of, the executive and the legislative, which they fully controlled. Also the courts, obviously the media, were newspapers back then, and the radio, and they nationalized all of the economy. They confiscated all of the properties of the different churches and religious groups. They banned a lot of religious groups. Others they just forced into semi-underground activity. Also, they banned all civil society NGOs that were not founded or sponsored by the Communist Party, including youth organizations and university organizations and student governments and so on and so forth. And it was probably some of the darkest days of Hungarian history. We only compare the 1950s, early 1950s, the Stalinist regime in Hungary to those of the days of 1944 when Hungary was under occupation by Nazi Germany, and Hitler gave free rein to the Hungarian Nazis, the so-called Arrow-Cross people who, 1944, in the spring of 1944, when Nazi Germany occupied Hungary, this is when the deportations of the Hungarian Jews started to Germany, to the concentration camps. Up until then, Hungary kind of jeopardized the process and refused to deport the Jews. And so most of 1944, we were under Nazi occupation, but we still had our semi-independent government, and Governor Horthy, he was the head of state, but the Nazis forced him out of office on October 15th, and that's when the total fascist nightmare rule started for Hungary. And because the deportations were not possible anymore, the Budapest Jewry was rounded up in the ghetto, and they started shooting them into the Danube, the river Danube. So that's what we can compare the early 1950s, the Stalinist rule in Hungary. So within a decade, Hungary went through hell twice. And so we had internment camps, we had labor camps run by the Stalinist government. Again, there was private property only existed in terms of personal property. So you could have your clothes, and you could have your books, and you could have your furniture, but nothing else. All property, all businesses were nationalized. My family was also a victim of that. My mother's family had a business that was confiscated, nationalized. Again, all church property and NGO property were nationalized. All the newspapers were either shut down or nationalized, and pretty much everything was run from one center by the Secretary General and for a while Prime Minister of the Communist Party called Mátyás Rákosi. And Rákosi is called the best Hungarian student of Stalin. Stalin's best student in Hungary, and people secretly hated him. And then something happens in 1953. Stalin dies, and that sends shockwaves through the Soviet bloc and the Soviet Union, and as expected, a fight for leadership in Moscow starts. And because the leaderships of the occupied countries, the Soviet bloc countries, were so directly tied to the leadership in Moscow, that immediately affected the leadership change in Moscow and the leadership fight, the crown's, the struggle for the crown, the throne, that affected directly what happened in Budapest and Warsaw and Prague and Bucharest and all the Soviet bloc countries, all the occupied countries. So a fight broke out in the Hungarian Communist Party between the circle of Rákosi, the best Hungarian student of Stalin, and Imre Nagy, who later became the leader of the 1956 revolution. Nagy, N-A-G-Y. Nagy was a communist, and he was a Muscovite. Muscovite means someone who was Hungarian or Czech or Slovak or Polish, but who lived in Moscow for an extended period of his life. They lived in Moscow or in the Soviet Union because they had to flee Hungary. The communists were persecuted before the war by the right-wing authoritarian regime of Governor Horthy, or Regent Horthy. And so they became converts of the communist ideology, the Stalinist ideology. They got jobs. They were part of the Soviet Communist Party. They were part of the Soviet bureaucracy, but they were waiting for their chance to go back to their homes and set up communist systems back home. So both Rákosi and his circle and Nagy and his circle, the members of their circles were Muscovites. They were educated in Moscow. They lived a long time in Moscow. And Rákosi actually had to flee to Moscow because he was in prison for being a communist in Hungary. So there's a lot of terror and imprisonment and brutality, as you can see, running through. And we're talking about 50 years of Hungarian history. So a big fight breaks out between the two circles. And so what is the difference? Rákosi was an absolute doctrinaire, kind of rigid Stalinist, again, Stalin's best pupil or best student in Hungary. He faithfully followed every crazy order that came from Moscow, from nationalization to internment camps and labor camps and whatever you can imagine in terms of brutal political oppression. And so Nagy was a different kind of communist. He, first of all, was proud to be Hungarian, and he also wanted to put a human face to communism. He wanted to see a country that was livable. He was probably quite conflicted after a while between his loyalty to the Communist Party and also to Hungary as a country, but also to his views about a livable country and freedoms and some kind of democratic pluralism. But mostly, he was a less brutal, a less crazy, communist leader than the opposite clique or the opposite faction. And so, because of the inner fighting for power in Moscow, Vedia, who was also up for, he threw his hat into the leadership fight in Moscow. Imre Nagy becomes prime minister in 1953, and we'll continue this story, but I want to welcome our speaker, who arrived from DC, was detained. Yeah. Yes.
Good to see you.
Good to see you. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Welcome.
Sorry, everybody. Should I sit?
Yes, please. Yeah. You have some water there, yeah. And I got started by, first of all, thanking our co-sponsors and recognizing some individuals in the audience. And I've also asked them to share some of their personal memories about 1956, which they graciously did. And then I started telling the audience about the background, the historical background of the revolution, which I started in 1945, and how the communist repression was built out during the late 40s and the early 50s. And now I want to introduce our speaker briefly and give the floor to him. Marion Smith is a civil society leader and an expert in international affairs. I think that all of us here in the room have in common, or we aspire to be that. He's the executive director of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation in Washington, D.C. And I also thank the foundation for bringing you here to speak to us. He's been the executive director since March 2014. Marion is a native of South Carolina. He's also chairman of the National Civic Arts Society. He was previously, before the Victims of Communism Foundation, a visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation in D.C. And his articles have appeared in publications including USA Today, The Hill, The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, National Review, and The Weekly Standard. But he's also a regular guest analyst on major network and cable television news channels, including ABC, NBC, MSNBC, Fox News, and CNN. I want to mention that Marion and I go way back. He has a very strong connection to Hungary. His wife is Hungarian, and I met Marion about a decade ago through your wife, Anna.
Wow. Yeah.
Anna is a fantastic and fabulous woman, also a political scientist and an expert in international affairs and American studies. She and I went to the same program in Hungary, and then she met you at Bard.
In New York.
In New York. And that's another connection the three of us have. I spent a year at Bard College during my university years, and I encouraged Anna to go to Bard and study there, and she got in and she got the scholarship, and she studied there, and she went to the Bard College's New York City program called Bard Globalization International Affairs Program. And that's where she met Marion. Anna is currently the executive director of the Hungary Initiatives Foundation, and he's also served as a diplomat for Hungary, including at the embassy in Washington, D.C. Marion is founding president of the Common Society, and I'm proud to say I was also a founder. He got his master's at Central European University in Budapest, so clearly you have a lot of Hungarian connections, and I'd like us to give a warm welcome to Marion Smith.
I give you a warm welcome for sticking it out and waiting for me. I landed at the airport and asked why the airport was so busy, and one guy looked at me and like I was an idiot and said, well, there's a medical convention.
Oh.
And then the other guy looked at me like I was an idiot and said, well, the Red Sox made the World Series. So I guess there are lots of reasons for the traffic.
You should have told them, because Fletcher is having
Well,
a Hungary
of course.
1956 commemoration.
Blame that on Hungarians too? I don't know. Well, thank you for hosting this. Thank you, Zoltan. It's wonderful to see you again. And you know, those Hungarian freedom fighters of 1956 were so brave, so courageous. They shifted in such an important way the world's understanding of what was happening behind the Iron Curtain, that every year on October 23rd, or this week in general, the next 2 weeks, it is certainly a good time to remember their courage, their sacrifice, and be inspired by them for the challenges that face us today. Because certainly freedom, human rights, democratic self-rule are under attack. I think that it's very safe to say that in the last few years, what we could consider the free world as a matter of geography is literally shrinking. That's true from Hong Kong to Venezuela to Crimea. And so there's a lot of work to do. The legacy that the Hungarian freedom fighters began in 1956 and then regaining independence and trying to overcome the legacy of decades of communism since 1989. That's a lesson that we need to learn, understand, and try to inspire ourselves and others. So thanks for hosting, and I know you want to have a conversation, so I'll wait for your questions.
Well, absolutely. Well, thank you again for being here. It's great to have you here, and so we'll come back to the '56 revolution in a minute, and I want to finish those few years that were where we left off in 1953 to 1956, what led to the revolution. But I would like to first ask you about the Victims of Communism Foundation. So in 2018, why is there a need for such a foundation? What is your work? You mentioned a lot of places, Venezuela, Crimea. Again, how did you get involved in this work?
Sure. Well, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation was established as the result of a unanimous act of Congress in late 1993. President Bill Clinton was on his way to meet Yeltsin, and there were a few bills and treaty ideas that they wanted to take along with him for that meeting. And there was essentially a trade and amity bill before Congress, and it needed to pass by unanimous consent so that it could make it in time for President Clinton's trip. And Tom Lantos in the House, a liberal Democrat from California and the only Holocaust survivor to serve in Congress, and his friend Jesse Helms, a conservative North Carolinian in the Senate, agreed that they would use this opportunity to insert a clause establishing the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation as a lasting tribute to those many millions of individuals who suffered, were killed in the various communist experiments behind the Iron Curtain, which of course the Soviet Union imposed in Central and Eastern Europe. And a few months later, we were established. In 2007, we dedicated the first memorial in the world, dedicated in memory of every victim of a communist regime. So that'd be from Cuba to North Korea, from Poland to Ethiopia. And President George W. Bush dedicated the memorial and served as our honorary chairman during the latter half of his presidency. Today, we host commemorative events in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere around the United States. We host and organize high school teacher seminars to help high school educators understand how to teach this difficult history in the classroom, connecting ideology with history, with human rights. And we've built on the wonderful work of the Holocaust Museum, which have run similar programs for many years. We also organize college, university events in all 50 states, trying to introduce interested parties to historians or dissidents, survivors of communist regimes. We have an oral history project called Witness, where we try to record and tell the stories of those who lived under a communist regime, to increasingly I'm a millennial, I'm an elder millennial, but our generation and those coming after have not been taught some basic facts about 20th century history. So unless it's your forte, and I'm sure everyone here knows almost everything there is to know about the 20th century, but if you're not focused on geopolitics or history, you probably don't have a good grasp of basic episodes of the 20th century. And of course, there's almost no international force that was so pivotal to world history than the international conspiracy, if you will, of communist parties who wanted to deprive individuals and communities of their freedoms and their rights and impose a utopian vision of mankind on humans. So it was human experimentation, social experimentation. And in every case, in the nearly 40 countries that it was imposed, it failed utterly. In every case where a communist party came to power, the economy either collapsed or a totalitarian police state was installed. Every single communist regime ended up killing its own citizens as a matter of policy in peacetime because of political or religious or artistic reasons, because they were viewed as enemies of the state because they ran afoul of the dogma that was currently in vogue. And I mean, it's of course worth noting that among the first who were targeted, including the Soviet Union in 1917, 18, and 19, were Marxists who had a different interpretation of what Marx and Engels meant. So it is a totalitarian ideology that is deeply flawed intellectually, and ideas have consequences. They denied, in terms of theory, fundamental aspects of human nature, and so it's no accident that it ended up destroying humans on a scale never before seen. Man-made famine on a scale never before seen. The death toll is
I was going to ask you,
conservatively
what's the death toll of communism?
100 million or more. And that is, you know, a difficult process to understand. It began some 20, 30 years ago by former Marxists who were shocked to learn what was happening behind the Iron Curtain. And they said, this is not the idea of international brotherhood that we had envisioned. The facts that we hear are too different than the vision, so we need to understand what's happening. They rejected communism, and then they began to try and understand a cataloging of those crimes. So the Black Book of Communism, published by Harvard in the early 90s, is the first systematic attempt to understand the numbers. But just to get at how difficult that is, I mean, you're dealing with closed societies who are not advertising the atrocities being committed. And you know, it is a difficult process to understand forensically what is happening. And I'm sorry to say that even when we do understand forensically what has happened, for example, in Cambodia with the Khmer Rouge, when nearly a fourth of the population was killed by that communist regime, we understand almost everything that happened. And there was an agreement between the new government of Cambodia and the United Nations to have an extraordinary tribunal to try those individuals responsible in the Khmer Rouge, and nothing has happened. And in fact, now old Khmer Rouge hands are back in power and are doing much of what they were used to doing before. So this is both a challenge of understanding what has happened, and then the moral courage and the political will to confront it and have a moral reckoning, which is not even to say a legal reckoning, but at least a moral reckoning, so that individuals in these countries do not then exercise the power that they illegitimately held in the Khmer Rouge days or in other regimes, and now hold in a quote-unquote democratic phase. So in a geopolitical sense, that's why the work of our foundation is still important. 20% of the world's population today lives in a single-party communist state. That is to say, a government where the only party in power is a communist party that has, in many cases, been implicated in the crimes of communist regimes in the 20th century. The big example here, of course, is China. The People's Republic of China is still ruled by the same party that committed the Tiananmen Square massacre, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, responsible for at least 50 million deaths of Chinese people, as well as Tibetans, Mongolians, Turkic Uyghurs, on and on. The biggest sufferers are the Han Chinese. It's important to remember that too. But it's illegal to talk about the Tiananmen Square massacre today. People's Republic of China holds the dubious distinction of being the only other regime to have killed a Nobel Peace Prize laureate in their custody, the other being Nazi Germany. And now we have very reliable evidence coming out of Xinjiang province, or East Turkistan, as the 1959 U.S. law refers to it, as a captive nation, where out of the 10 million or so Uyghurs in that province, 1 million of them are now understood to be in re-education camps. And the purpose here is very clear. And it's not only, the majority of the population are Turkic Muslims. And yet there are Christians and other religious minorities included. And the purpose of these re-education camps are to obliterate any idea of religion from the population. And this is just one of many steps that have been taken in China under the leadership of Xi Jinping, who is the most Maoist leader that China has had since Mao. And so, we went through a phase where we had reform leaders in China. After 1989, as you all know, there was a sort of bargain. Deng Xiaoping, we were going to have some sort of economic opening and freedom, as long as you didn't try to use that in a political way, right? Well, that's played out, and a lot of the economic growth was the result of, bad deals, to use that phrase, between China and other trading partners, and WTO rules that were not enforced, et cetera, artificial devaluing of the currency, on, and the use of slave labor in China. We can't ignore that either. So you add all this on, and North Korea, Laos, Vietnam, and Cuba. And then we have everything that's played out in the last 2 years in Venezuela, where there have been thousands of Cuban military and intelligence agents who have propped up the regime of Maduro, and his bodyguard, are all Cuban. The Cubans have learned from the Soviets how to prevent defections among your military and your National Guard. So there's been a rule for the last several years in Venezuela where above a certain rank you don't meet in a room if it's only 2 or 3 of you without a Cuban present. And that is to prevent defections from the National Guard and the military. Well, okay, so 2 decades ago, Venezuela was one of the most prosperous countries in the Western Hemisphere. And now there's no toilet paper, the basic medical stuffs are unavailable, and it's one of the largest refugee flows in the world right now. And that is the result purely of a political party and alliances with Cuba who have sold out and basically exploited and colonized the country of Venezuela for the only Marxist remaining regime in the Western Hemisphere, which would not have existed had it not been for the Soviet Union. So, these things are still shaping our world. What has happened in Crimea and Ukraine, and what has happened, the reality of Belarus and Russia. Vladimir Putin has allowed now or directed the destruction of Gulag archives and files, preventing us from having an accurate understanding of what took place during the Soviet Union. And of course, while the Ukrainians, especially in Western Ukraine, have been tearing down statues of Vladimir Lenin and Soviet hammers and sickles and stars from buildings and various squares, they're erecting new statues of Lenin in Russia, and of course new statues of Mao in China. So, I really wish that our generation didn't this century have to prevent this totalitarian ideology from controlling the lives of those it controls, and from spewing propaganda and misinformation into our own societies, and preventing us from understanding what's happening in the world and doing good things about it.
Thank you. I was going to ask you, to talk about the context, but I think you've given a very broad context to, what the Hungarian experience, what the Czechoslovak experience in the 20th century fits in today, which is, the communist ideology surviving and still controlling some significant parts of the world. To look back to Hungary in 1956. So I got as far as 1953, and I said, after the death of Stalin, a fight broke out within the leadership in Moscow for obviously stepping into Stalin's vacant shoes. And so Vedia rose as one of the figures, along with Khrushchev and a couple of others, who were vying for this power. And so Vedia was very much supportive of Imre Nagy, the leader of, the let's say the more liberal or more democratic faction within the Hungarian Communist Party. And so because Vedia got his way, Imre Nagy was appointed prime minister in 1953, and he started his rule with, tearing down all those measures that made the Stalinist system in Hungary so unbearable. So he did away with forced kolchozization, the herding of peasants into the kolchozes, these communitarian units of agricultural production. He closed the internment and labor camps, which were holding political prisoners, and in a lot of cases, the labor camps were mines. So it was heavy and brutal work, and a lot of the prisoners died. And just imagine these people. When we talk about political prisoners, you could have in the same cell or the same unit of an internment camp or labor camp a Marxist dissident, a social democrat, a priest, a Catholic priest, and a liberal Jew, all in the same cell because they were threats to the Stalinist system. And so a lot of these oppressive measures were done away with by Imre Nagy, but as the fight continued in Moscow, the fight continued in Hungary, and in 1955, Nagy was again replaced by Rákosi's, Stalin's best Hungarian pupils, surrogate, and at that time, Hegedűs became the prime minister. So power went back to the Stalinist faction. And so in 1956, after so in February 1956, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union held its 20th Congress, in which Khrushchev finally takes the reign of the Communist Party and proclaims
Mistakes were made.
De-Stalinization.
Yeah.
So kind of the deconstructive of the cult of Stalin, and that still didn't really affect how things in the occupied countries were continuing. So in Hungary, the Stalinist faction kept their grip on power, and half a year later, on October 23rd, people had just had enough of Stalinism, and they rose up against it. So this is where we come to October 23rd and the Hungarian Revolution. What do you think when you're a good friend of Hungary's, and you're also a student of history and of communism and of Eastern Europe. You know this history very well. What do you think when you think of the Hungarian Revolution? What was the significance of the 1956 revolution in Hungary?
I think viewing it as an American from the United States, there was still a perspective that ideologically or intellectually, communism still represented a very hopeful system, right? You had a lot of American intellectuals who went to the Soviet Union in the 20s and the 30s, viewed this as the way forward. You also had, frankly, intellectuals from the United States who viewed National Socialism in Germany in the 30s as a way forward. Both presented themselves as sort of modern scientific approaches to society. And of course, we didn't really have any historical evidence as to what these systems might mean in practice yet. But by the 1930s, we did, because of what was happening in Ukraine with the Holodomor and the man-made famine of the Soviet Union. And you know, to our great shame, there were many publications in the United States who parroted Soviet propaganda during that time, including Walter Duranty at the New York Times. He won Pulitzers for his coverage of the crisis in Ukraine, in which he was copying and pasting Soviet propaganda, denying that there was a man-made famine happening in Ukraine, in which millions of Ukrainians were deliberately killed by the Soviets, not because of lack of grain, but because of the agricultural policy that was put in place against the Ukrainians. But of course, we didn't even fully understand that, and then in World War II, turned out good old Uncle Joe became our ally. And of course, not even many students of history at the high school or college level today even realize that World War II could not have started, certainly not in the way that it did, not when it did, without the collusion of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. So, well, good timing on that.
Yeah.
That was definitely
The revolution.
that was definitely a storm brewing, and the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, August 23rd, paved the way for 2 weeks later for Hitler to invade Poland and for the Soviets to invade Poland, Finland, and the Baltic states, and could not have happened otherwise. Now, we have to understand that intellectually and in terms of the movements, the Bolsheviks and the National Socialists in Germany, they had been collaborating, they had been supporting each other. And after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed for a year and a half, when Soviet dissidents escaped into German territory, the SS turned them back over to the Soviets, and when Jews or others escaped from the Third Reich into Russian-held territory, they were turned back over and to the Nazis. It was only after Stalin reneged on after Hitler reneged on the deal and invaded the Soviet Union that he then turned to the United States and became an ally. So that was the sort of stage, and many Americans still thought of the Soviets as an ally in World War II by 1953, 56. And so it was, despite Winston Churchill's speech and the Truman policy, establishing, Churchill's Iron Curtain speech in Missouri, and then Truman leading an effort to establish NATO, the National Security, NSC, CIA, other structures that would, infrastructure that would allow us to confront the Soviet Union,
The Marshall Plan.
the Marshall Plan, which those who were paying attention to defense and national security understood was a reality. But I think in the public mind in the United States, there was still not an understanding that communist regimes were a threat to our freedom and were an enemy of human rights and freedom around the world. But when the Soviets, after having claimed that they were going to allow free elections in Central and Eastern Europe, of course that played out for more than a decade. But when the Hungarians, as the first armed resistance against that farce, made its way into Western media, so it's the Time magazine freedom fighter image I think is just iconic.
Man of the Year,
And
Person of the Year.
Right, and I think
Hungarian
that
freedom fighter.
that helped to shift our understanding. And then the other that always sticks out in my mind, just because it is just a horribly captivating photo, and also because I've heard so many other people mention it who were alive at that time, and it affected them. And then, of course, it was featured in many different media outlets. But there was a photograph of young Hungarians in the street after the Soviet tanks had come in, dead in the streets, lined up in their teens and 20s, boys and girls who looked just like the boys and girls in Boston and New York. But these boys and girls had to find arms and devise Molotov cocktails and try to blow up Soviet tanks who were an invading force in their country. And sadly, and I hate to say it, but I think it is true, American diplomatic and intelligence efforts behind the Iron Curtain did support dissidents. It did encourage them to confront the Soviet Union and the puppet communist governments in Central and Eastern Europe. And maybe we weren't even prepared for the courage of the Hungarian freedom fighters of 1956. But the reality is, when they had pushed the Soviets out of Budapest and were on the airwaves begging for some support in an unprecedented overthrow by young civilians of an occupying communist force, we did not help them. We did not help them. And that potentially could have led to the breakup of the Soviet bloc. But instead, they came in, they crushed the Hungarian Revolution. Thousands were killed. Many fled. And it was not until 1989 that we could see an end to communist rule in Hungary. Now that said, that was the first armed resistance of a Soviet-occupied country. And maybe that is a reason why, after that, Kadar, there was a sort of less heavy hand on the Hungarians.
After
The Russians knew
after the
they
initial
could not push.
retribution.
They could not push Hungarians too hard. So the happiest barrack in the Soviet bloc.
They called Hungary the happiest barrack of the Soviet bloc because
Worth
the post-revolution
some
leadership,
lessening
yeah.
of the totalitarian system, but it remained. But I think in the West it had a huge impact on removing the veil of propaganda and misinformation about what the Soviet Union was actually up to. They were not some sort of new benign force in world politics. They were just the latest, most modern totalitarian version of imperialism. And as it turned out to date, at that time, the most ruthless, the most bloodthirsty. And, at least the National Socialists were somewhat more honest about their ends. But the Soviets did perfect a double talk, and what they would say in the West through their diplomats and other propaganda efforts were just absolutely the opposite of what was actually happening in the Soviet Union and in the puppet governments of Central and Eastern Europe. So, and then we had, the Prague uprising, then we had Solidarity in Poland. They were inspired by the Hungarians. They will tell you this. Many of them have told me that. Many American anti-communists were inspired by it. There were many American Marxists, even collaborators with the Soviet Union, or even agents of the intelligence services of the Soviet Union, who were so shocked by what occurred in Budapest in 1956. And we should remember, throughout Hungary, it was not just Budapest. It was other cities where there were also uprisings that were violently suppressed, and many, and 1 in 5 families. 1 in 5 families in Hungary during the communist era had a family member who was either exiled or arrested and detained in a political prison or executed. Right? That's affecting the entire population. So we hear about Albania and how totalitarian and total that oppression was, but it totally affected the psyche of the Hungarian people, and for decades. But in America, in the West, it was a moment that you could not avoid. And so you had to deal with the nature of the Soviet Union. And then we had to talk about, what is our response? What is our response? Paul Goebel, who is one of the absolute foremost scholars of the Soviet Union and the Baltics, and he was growing up in Middle America at that time. His parents took in a young Hungarian refugee from '56. And because I asked, how did you get started in this? What piqued your interest, right? And he said that young Hungarian who stayed with his family, he had witnessed his mother burnt up trying to destroy a Soviet tank in the streets of Budapest. And then, of course, it's important that we talk about the refugees who came out of Hungary during that time, ending up throughout Europe, Australia, Canada, the United States. They and the other refugee flows from communist countries shaped our country. And many of those communities, the Hungarian Americans in the United States, organized themselves and formed a counter force to the communist-controlled Hungarian embassy in Washington. And that and the Hungarian and the Polish movements led to a captive nations movement, which did counter the propaganda. And those individuals then, after 1989, pushed for Hungarian membership in NATO and joining the EU, et cetera, et cetera. So '56 was a pivotal moment in just the history of global communism. But I think it was a turning point in the history of American anti-communism, because there we had the evidence was spilled out, and we had to confront it, and then we had to think about how we were going to respond.
Thank you so much. That was excellent, and answered so many questions I was going to pose, but we talked before the event, and thank you for also addressing American responsibility. There's a great book by Charles Gotti, who's professor of Russian Eastern European Studies at Johns Hopkins SAIS, which is our rival, but that's okay. He's a 56er himself. He's a Holocaust survivor himself. It's called Failed Illusions. It was also published in 2006 for the 50th anniversary. And it addresses specifically American activities during the revolution, both the encouragement of the revolution through Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and also the abandonment of the Hungarian revolutionaries later in the process. But we have to acknowledge too that, and I said this in the beginning, that the American people didn't quite agree with that policy.
No.
They wanted more support.
Absolutely.
And there was so much support organized by civilians, American civilians. Elvis Presley went on the Ed Sullivan Show and sang a wonderful song and asked for donations for the Hungarian revolutionaries. There were individuals who would transport aid packages on the Danube River from Vienna. And as I mentioned, and you alluded to it too, there were tens of thousands of refugees taken in by the United States who, as you said, have enriched the life of this country. And we have here Susan Banki, who's a graduate of Fletcher and is an adjunct professor here teaching a class on global migration. And she talked a little bit about her family experience. Her father is a 56 refugee.
I'm so sorry I have to go, but I did just want to say something before I left.
Susan, please.
As the daughter of a Holocaust survivor and a refugee, I so much appreciate your discussion about what has been done in the name of communism and how problematic that is. and I say this with great respect, I do find it problematic that at a School of International Relations where students have incredible nuance and are learning different sides of things, you fail to mention what has been done in the name of anti-communism. Because we know that, and I really appreciate your acknowledgement that the US government has failed in the revolution. But the US government and the involvement of the CIA in fighting many communist regimes has destroyed many, many, many lives. And I'm not saying that makes communism okay, but I think it's disingenuous for you to spread that word in this mess, in this room, and particularly with people that are not as critical thinkers. And I'm so sorry to be disrespectful, say that and then leave, but I've had my hand up for 10 minutes and I really wanted to say it earlier. So I can stay for like 1 minute if you want to say things, and then I really have to go, I'm sorry.
Well, I think there's absolutely, mistakes that have been made in the effort to confront what I refer to as an international conspiracy. Out of those 40 countries that have been ruled by a communist party with a death toll of more than 100 million, they all stem back to the root of Lenin-installed Bolshevik Soviet communism. All the other regimes were either trained or funded, inspired, installed, imposed by regimes that were established from the Soviet Union. That is true, as we've even talked about now with Venezuela and the Cuban involvement, and those Cuban agents and services being trained by the Soviet Union. So, it is absolutely, and I don't know what specific examples you're referring to.
So Latin America,
Yeah,
the CIA's
sure.
involvement in Latin America, the CIA's involvement with supporting the KMT. It's arguable that that's the reason that authoritarian regime has lasted in Myanmar and Burma until, say, 2006. So I'm not saying that it's of the same scale. I'm not pro-communist. But what I am saying is I think that nuance actually will strengthen your argument rather than taking it away. Because what I see
it's difficult
is
to
that
talk
the
about.
CIA has quite significant responsibility in its fear of communism. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, it's difficult to talk about. It's difficult to talk about everything.
Yeah.
So once it's brought up, then we can talk about it.
Yeah.
I certainly am not and have never defended something that would be antithetical to our values.
I think that's a key point.
And
you both are making, that it's antithetical.
And Pinochet or Franco or other regimes who have used the language of anti-communism
Right.
to do things that were out of the communist playbook, I think is reprehensible. However, I would point out that I think it is a giant mistake to pretend, as Lenin tried to talk about it, that somehow National Socialism and International Socialism are on opposite ends of the political spectrum. I don't think that's true. I think Nazism and fascism and violent socialism and communism are all on the totalitarian, unfree side of the spectrum. And I think what the United States has represented, and by the way, despite any collusion by high-ranking people who might consider themselves a part of the American left with the Soviet Union, or the excesses of people like Senator McCarthy. Those are outliers in the American political culture. Anti-communism and anti-fascism have always been American ideas, and it troubles me immensely to see hammer and sickle flags and Nazi flags on the streets of the United States waved by people younger than me who should have been educated about the totalitarian systems that almost destroyed human civilization last century.
But I think
Okay.
for nuance, we need to be educated.
Well, for
on both
nuance,
sides.
they should have learned it in high school. They should have learned it in high school. So, thanks for raising it.
Yes,
I
thank you
want
for
I'm
raising
so
it.
sorry to leave.
No, no.
I really,
No, I think this
say
is
that
an
with
important
great respect.
conversation.
I appreciate you raising it.
Fight on, Fletcher students.
I appreciate her raising it, but this is a false dichotomy that you either have to choose communism or fascism. I reject both. My family's fought against totalitarian and fascist systems since they were devised, right?
Yes.
So this is not the way forward. Okay, we have something else. We have democratic self-government, free enterprise, the rule of law, and human rights. And both fascism and communism are antithetical to that. They deny the superiority of individual rights and freedom. And the great successes that we've had in this country, where we overcame inequality or were failing to live up to our own founding ideals, were not by appealing to fascism or communism. They were by appealing to our own Declaration of Independence about liberty and equality.
I want to give the floor to Professor Schultz.
Yep.
And obviously,
Yeah.
we've opened up the floor, and I also want to encourage you to,
So-
enjoy our reception while, we're talking.
Oh, I had a question actually, and then a couple of observations.
Yes, please.
And my question is that 56, along with, the Khrushchev speech was a very important speech in 56. Most students don't. You mentioned it, but let me elaborate on it. So Khrushchev, when he spoke, he talked about the crimes of Stalin. And in the crimes of Stalin, in conjunction with crushing the revolution in Hungary, had a profound impact on communism in America. And Communist Party in America declined precipitously because of that. And it never really made a comeback here. And I think that those events were important, even in the New Left, of the 60s. The Communist Party was a bit player. So 56 in that respect was absolutely critical. I couldn't agree more. And when you put it in conjunction with that speech, I remember, as maybe in high school, reading The God That Failed. And the book The God That Failed really was former communists and very famous ones, like Arthur Kessler.
Yes.
Louis
I was
Fisher.
going to mention Kessler. Yes.
Yeah. So, those events were really, really important, and they were in tandem. And I know you were alluding to that, but I wanted to really drive home Khrushchev's speech and what that meant. In terms of the fascism and communism, in Germany they were enemies, and the Germans, the German Communist Party, and the fascists fought it out in the streets of Berlin in the 20s.
Also in Austria.
And
Vienna.
in the early 30s.
Civil war
Now it's
between
true that Stalin aligned himself with Hitler. But inside Nazi Germany, among the first to go to Dachau were the communists. So there was, the fascists and the communists, it's good if you can play them off against one another, then maybe they'll eliminate one another. But it is a fact that those ideologies, while both repressive, were enemies of one another, and we saw that in Germany in the 20s, and then in the 30s, once the Nazis came to power, they eviscerated the Communist Party. So that's just a little bit of history. But I couldn't agree more with the importance of 56. In Washington, it was a dilemma, because overlying all this was the nuclear issue, and the fear of
Sure.
of that.
Sure.
But I always felt that the U.S. didn't wrap itself in glory by encouraging this, and not helping. But what would that help have looked like? Let me ask that as a question.
That's a
What
hard,
would
that's
that
a
help
hard
have
question,
looked
yes.
It's something in the previous question, it is something to talk about historically, right? There was a debate in the early days of the CIA as to whether or not they would be purely a reconnaissance intelligence gathering organization, or if they would do covert operations.
Well, they did do covert operations.
Well, but what decided it was not an academic argument playing out.
Yeah.
It was the fact that the communists were about to win the Italian election.
Yeah.
And it was, how catastrophic that would be.
Oh, yeah.
Because then the Iron Curtain might be on the Italian-Swiss border, right, instead on the Austrian-Hungarian border, right?
Yeah, but go to
But
56.
that is what then decided the question, that the CIA would in fact be, because if they can fly in a few suitcases of cash and deliver them to a few politicians and a few mayors and a few journalists and swing the election, which they did, that's a historical fact.
No, I know I knew William
right.
Colby quite well. who was
So those kinds of things can be done, right?
But what
and
would
and
you
there,
do in 56?
well, there are lots of
when
things
there
that
was
could have
another-
been done, and we have this discussion all the time when we see a sort of slow burn crisis playing out. You know, the Rwandan genocide,
But would you have
Syria,
armed them?
Venezuela.
Would you have sent arms in? I mean, it's just it's a real question. I'm not trying to be
Yeah,
provocative.
yeah, yeah.
I'm trying to think this through.
Well,
I mean, we could arm
yeah,
them.
it seems to me as a sort of, you know, exercise here. They didn't need arms. They needed diplomatic support that the Soviets couldn't go back in to Budapest and crush and reverse what had already happened. The Hungarians had already reestablished a free government,
Yeah.
officially. So what they needed was the moral courage and the political will to tell the Soviets at the United Nations and elsewhere that don't you dare send your tanks back in there to colonize a country that, contrary to your previous statements, doesn't want you there,
Yeah. No.
They don't want you
Yeah,
there.
I think that's,
right?
I think that's
So, you know, and you were right to mention that the American people did support it, but when at that time it was the United States and the Soviet Union, right? Those were the two superpowers. And so we could have made a difference. We could have made a difference. We can make a difference right now in Hong Kong, right? But the same thing is playing out.
Let's stay on 56. Let's let Hong Kong out of this.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sympathetic to what you're saying. I'm just trying to understand, you know, what the levers,
Yeah.
you know, we could have made an issue of it at the UN. The Soviets thought the UN was a joke. So, you know, I'm just trying to find where the pressure points were to do something. You know, what you think the pressure.
Well, I mean, we had agents in Hungary at that time. The Soviets, you know, many of their allegations against those that they convicted and, you know, executed, whether they were colluding with the United States. So would it have benefited mankind for us to have supported, you know, we could have instantly recognized the Nod government and supported them diplomatically.
I was going to say that.
We could have
I think-
created a
I think the
trade
recognition
treaty.
of the Nod government,
Yeah, that would have been.
given it,
Yeah.
you know, given, you know, the independence of Hungary,
We-
because Nod withdrew Hungary from the Warsaw Pact. And,
Yeah, yeah. We could have hour by hour increased the risks for the Soviets to go back in, but we didn't.
Yeah.
We didn't.
Well, there was Suez. There was a lot of distraction, but yeah, I think
that's-
I think diplomacy.
Well, I've been
yeah.
dominating this.
Yeah.
So let someone else.
No,
have it.
Yeah.
It's
Any
great.
any
Good
other
discussion.
questions
Or comments.
or comments? Yes, Alex.
So I'm interested in kind of the memorialization aspect of this a bit more, and wondering if you could talk about how receptive or unreceptive Hungary has been to memorializing these victims within the country, and how that process has played out.
Sorry, just
Sure. How the process of memorialization for victims of communism has played out within Hungary.
within Hungary.
Yeah. So their
Okay.
acknowledgement of atrocities and such.
Hey, thank you. Well, I mean, the reburial of Imre Nagy was a pivotal moment, and that was a sort of backward-looking action that was trying to redress an injustice because it had a very current and forward-looking ramification. And at the reburial of Imre Nagy, the current Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán, played a key role. He has been supportive of these efforts, right? He's also allowed the Russian government and Vladimir Putin to install a Soviet war dead memorial in Hungary. And, you know, in 1989, as the Hungarians were taking their country back, the events that played out in Tiananmen Square in China figured very heavily. They paid attention to that. It felt like a movement was happening. Because that happened in June 3rd and 4th, beginning in late May. And then you had the very first crossings by East Germans and others, including some Hungarians, on the Austrian-Hungarian border, where for the first time, Hungarian officials allowed the barbed wire to be cut on the Iron Curtain, and there was a refugee flow, then a stream that started. And then, of course, in November, you had the Berlin Wall, the breach, and then the fall of it. So, you know, it was disappointing for me to see Viktor Orban go and lay a wreath when he was visiting Beijing recently, you know, in honor of the communist forces there. Symbolism matters, and it loses its meaning if you treat everybody the same. So I think we are living in a world where it is very difficult to keep an accurate understanding of what occurred in the 20th century alive. We need to learn those lessons. And there's just a justice. It's sad that people who were arrested in the middle of the night and shot in the back of the head, we don't know who they were, right? That's injustice, right? So I think that memory, memorialization of the victims is very important. We have a lot to learn from our Jewish friends who have done a phenomenal job honoring those who suffered during the Holocaust and in other episodes of anti-Semitic violence, and helping us to understand that that kind of anti-Semitism or fascist movements that scapegoat certain minorities can lead again to horrible episodes if we don't learn those lessons. So memorials and commemorative days and things like that are a wonderful time for us to remind ourselves that we don't want to experience things like that again. The same is true for the victims of communist regimes who were, you know, targeted and killed because they were viewed as enemies of the state. Many of them not wanting to be involved in politics at all. The majority of those who suffered and were imprisoned and targeted by the state were just living a life and ran afoul of state authorities. So, you know, we have a lot of work to do on that. And in Central and Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union, this issue is more political than it is in the United States. There are, you know, people who have skin in the game, and it makes it a more difficult conversation.
And the memorialization process is much farther along, obviously, because we were kind of first-hand victims of communism and fascism. So we do have a day of the victims of the Holocaust,
Yes.
and we also have a day of the victims of communism in Hungary. And there are similar processes underway in other Eastern Bloc countries.
Yeah.
But I think...
And I would have mentioned
Yeah.
that, you know, Hungary and the other countries of Central and Eastern Europe donated as governments to the memorial that was erected in Washington in 2007. And the Hungarian government has also donated to the museum project that we are now currently involved in to establish a museum in D.C. So, you know, there's important work to do here. And, you know, when you have countries like Russia who are spending a lot of money and a lot of effort to revise history, they are revisionist forces, not only in terms of geography, but in terms of history. Same with China.
Same with China.
These things become even more important to do, and frankly, it requires even diplomacy. You know, when things that are said, like when Putin said that Russia never invaded Poland,
Right.
you know, a year or two ago, you know, that's the kind of thing that should have warranted an official response, right? We fought a war over what happened there. A lot of Americans died because of that.
With that, I'd like to thank Marion Smith
Thank you.
for joining us today and for a very lively discussion. And we don't have to stop here. We have a few more minutes with the reception here in the foyer, and we can continue. Marion will stick around for a few more minutes to talk to you individually, and we might seek his advice on the life in D.C. In policy.
In the swamp.
He's a policy practitioner, so a lot of people at Fletcher aspire to that, to embark on that path. But in any case, thank you all for coming, and thank you all for the lively discussion, and especially thank you, Marion, for being here with us on October 23rd, the day of the Hungarian Revolution in 1956.
My pleasure.